The cruelest people are usually the ones who think nobody important is watching. The holding room at Westbrook Precinct smelled like bleach, wet concrete, and burnt coffee that had been sitting on a warmer too long. A buzzing fluorescent light flickered overhead, turning every face pale except hers. Naomi Ellison sat quietly on the metal bench with her hands folded in her lap, her dark gray coat still damp from the cold October rain outside. Water dripped slowly from the hem onto the tile floor beneath her shoes. Across the room, Officer Daniel Brooks leaned against the counter scrolling through his phone while Sergeant Kyle Mercer signed paperwork without even looking up. Somewhere deeper inside the station, somebody laughed loud enough for the sound to echo through the hallway. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the security camera mounted high in the corner. Its tiny red light blinked steadily. Watching, recording, remembering. You hear me? Mercer suddenly barked without lifting his head. Naomi looked back at him calmly. Yes, officer. He finally looked up then, irritated by the softness in her voice more than the words themselves. Her calmness bothered him. People usually argued by now. Usually they demanded lawyers or threatened complaints or cried from fear after sitting in that room for 20 minutes. But the black woman in front of him had done none of those things. She had simply sat there in silence while rain tapped softly against the narrow windows near the ceiling. Brooks smirked as he walked closer. Funny thing about people, he said, spinning a pair of electric clippers loosely in his hand. They always act different once you strip away what makes them feel special. Naomi said nothing. Mercer pushed his chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. You caused a disturbance tonight, he said. Interfered with an act of arrest. Naomi's voice stayed level. I asked if the teenager understood his rights. Brooks laughed under his breath. See? That attitude right there. The clippers clicked once as he turned them on for a second, then off again. The sharp mechanical buzz filled the room before disappearing into silence. Naomi slowly glanced toward the hallway where the teenage boy had been taken earlier. She could still remember the fear in his eyes under the flashing red and blue patrol lights outside the grocery store parking lot. 17 years old at most. Thin hoodie, trembling hands. Nobody had stepped forward for him until she did. Mercer walked around behind Naomi's chair now, rolling up the sleeves of his uniform shirt. You people always think you know the law, he muttered. Naomi's jaw tightened almost invisibly, but her posture never changed. The rain outside grew heavier, rattling softly against the windows. Brooks placed the clippers onto the metal counter beside her with deliberate care. Maybe a new look will help with that attitude. Another officer near the doorway chuckled nervously but said nothing. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the floor for a moment. Long silver earrings brushed lightly against the collar of her coat as she moved. Her natural curls rested against her shoulders, still slightly wet from the storm outside. Mercer stared at her reflection in the dark glass window. Funny thing is, he said quietly, people stop acting important real fast once they lose what they hide behind. The room became very still. Even the distant laughter from down the hallway faded away. Naomi took one slow breath through her nose. Calm. Controlled. Almost impossibly calm. Brooks picked up the clippers again. The buzzing sound returned, louder this time, vibrating through the cold fluorescent air while the red security camera light continued blinking above them like a heartbeat nobody noticed. The electric clippers hummed closer until the sound became the only thing Naomi Ellison could hear. Officer Brooks stood beside her chair with a crooked smile while Sergeant Mercer watched from across the room, arms folded tightly over his chest like a man enjoying a lesson being taught. The fluorescent light above them flickered again, washing the station in a pale gray glow that made the wet floor shine like ice. Naomi stared at her reflection in the dark window beside the booking desk. Calm eyes. Steady breathing. Rainwater still clinging to the collar of her coat. She remembered another rainy night almost 30 years earlier when her father had sat beside her at a small kitchen table in Baltimore and told her something she never forgot. Dignity is the one thing people cannot take unless you hand it to them. Back then, Naomi had been 17 years old, sitting beneath a leaking ceiling while her father worked through stacks of overnight janitor shifts at the courthouse downtown. He used to come home smelling like floor polish and old paper files. Every morning before school, he would point at the courthouse across the street and tell her that the law mattered only if it protected people nobody cared about. Naomi believed him. She believed him when teachers underestimated her. She believed him during law school when professors acted surprised by how articulate she sounded. She believed him during her first years as a public defender when clients walked into her office already expecting the system to fail them. And she believed him now while the buzzing clippers waited inches away from her hair. Brooks placed a rough hand against the back of the chair. "Still quiet," he muttered. "That confidence is fading now, huh?" Naomi slowly turned her eyes toward him. "No," she said softly. "Confidence and noise are not the same thing." Brooks rolled his eyes while another officer behind the desk snorted with amusement. Mercer stepped forward and grabbed a clipboard from the counter. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. "People like you walk around acting like rules apply to everybody except you." Naomi almost smiled at the irony of the sentence, but she stopped herself. Instead, she lowered her eyes toward the silver bracelet on her wrist. Her late mother had given it to her 15 years earlier after Naomi won her first judgeship election. Small engraved letters lined the inside of the metal. "Grace under pressure." Naomi could still hear her mother saying the words. Outside the narrow station windows, thunder rolled somewhere across the city. The storm had deepened. Cars hissed through wet streets beyond the parking lot, while red and blue patrol lights reflected across puddles like broken glass. Inside the station, the air felt colder now. Brooks switched the clippers off again and leaned closer toward Naomi. "You know what is funny?" he said quietly. "People always look real different after a little humility." Naomi glanced toward the security camera blinking above the doorway, then toward the hallway where the young teenager still sat waiting alone in another room. Fear had filled that boy's face earlier tonight. Fear mixed with embarrassment. Naomi knew that expression too well. She had spent her entire career watching decent people shrink themselves just to survive humiliation. Mercer checked the clock on the wall. Nearly midnight. He exhaled heavily before nodding toward Brooks. "Go ahead," he said flatly. The clippers buzzed back to life. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second as the sound filled the room again. But when she opened them, her expression remained completely steady. And somehow, that calmness unsettled the officers far more than anger ever could. The first strand of hair fell silently onto Naomi Ellison's shoulder before sliding down the front of her damp coat, like a dark ribbon sinking through water. Officer Brooks guided the clippers slowly, almost casually, as if stretching out the moment for his own amusement. The buzzing machine vibrated through the cold air, while Sergeant Mercer watched from nearby with the detached expression of someone convinced he was completely justified. Naomi kept her eyes forward. She focused on the blinking red camera light above the booking desk instead of the clippers moving across her scalp. Outside, rainwater streamed down the station windows in silver lines, distorting the parking lot lights into trembling smears of red and gold. Somewhere behind the holding cells, a phone rang unanswered. Mercer grabbed a styrofoam cup of coffee from the counter and took a long sip without looking away from her. "You know what I learned after 22 years wearing this badge?" he asked quietly. "The people who talk the most about respect are usually the ones who deserve it the least." Brooks laughed under his breath, while another patch of curls slid down onto the tile floor. Naomi listened without reacting. Her silence had started changing the room. Earlier, the officers had sounded relaxed, entertained even. But now their voices carried an edge beneath the humor. Something uneasy, something uncertain. Mercer noticed it too. He stepped closer, lowering his coffee cup onto the desk with a soft thud. "Still acting calm," he muttered. "I do not think you understand where you are." Naomi finally turned her head slightly toward him. "I understand perfectly," she said. Her voice remained low and steady, forcing Mercer to narrow his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while rain hammered harder against the roof. Naomi could smell wet pavement drifting in every time the station door opened somewhere down the hallway. She remembered standing outside another courthouse years ago on a stormy morning just like this one, moments before taking her oath as a federal judge. Her mother had fixed the collar of her robe and whispered something Naomi carried with her ever since. "Some people will spend their lives trying to make you feel small. Never help them do it." Brooks ran the clippers again, slower this time. Tiny dark curls continued gathering around the base of the chair. One younger female officer near the fingerprint station glanced over briefly before looking away again, her face tense with discomfort. Naomi noticed that too. She noticed everything. The officer pretending not to watch. The camera blinking overhead. The stack of unsigned incident reports near Mercer's desk. The teenager still sitting silently behind the frosted glass partition down the hall. She noticed how power changed people when they believed nobody important could challenge them. Mercer leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "You should have minded your business tonight," he said. The kid was resisting. Naomi answered immediately. He was frightened. Brooks rolled his eyes. Always an excuse. Naomi slowly lifted her gaze toward him. "Fear is not a crime." The room went quiet again. Even Brooks stopped smiling for a second. Mercer exhaled sharply through his nose before forcing out a dry laugh. "You really think you are teaching somebody something in here?" Naomi did not answer right away. The clippers powered off with a sharp click, leaving only the sound of rain and distant thunder surrounding them. Finally she spoke, calm as ever. "No," she said softly. "I think people reveal themselves when they believe there will be no consequences." Mercer stared at her without blinking. For the first time that night, something behind his expression shifted almost invisibly. Not guilt. Not yet. Just the faintest flicker of discomfort. And above them all, the red camera light continued blinking steadily in the corner, recording every second in silence. Naomi Ellison could feel the cold air against the bare lines now visible along the side of her head where her curls had once rested. Tiny loose strands clung to the damp fabric of her coat, while Officer Brooks brushed more hair from her shoulder with careless fingers, almost like dusting off lint. The electric clippers powered down again, leaving behind a strange silence inside the station. Not peaceful silence. Heavy silence. The kind that settles into a room when people begin sensing they may have crossed a line they cannot uncross. Sergeant Mercer refused to acknowledge that feeling. He grabbed another stack of paperwork from the desk and flipped through it aggressively, trying to reclaim the atmosphere of control he usually carried so easily. "Book her for obstruction," he muttered, "and disorderly conduct." The younger female officer standing near the printer hesitated. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "there is no body cam footage showing." Mercer cut her off instantly with a sharp look. "Did I ask for commentary?" The woman lowered her eyes and quietly returned to typing. Naomi watched the exchange without speaking. Her silence continued, making everyone uncomfortable. Most people begged by now. Most people threatened lawsuits or demanded phone calls or shouted insults through tears. But Naomi sat upright beneath the harsh fluorescent lights with the stillness of someone who had already survived far worse things than humiliation. Brooks leaned against the counter beside her and smirked. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. "You think acting calm makes you better than everybody else." Naomi slowly turned her gaze toward him. "No," she answered softly. "I think cruelty speaks loudest when nobody interrupts it." Brooks opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Somewhere down the hall, the teenage boy from earlier began coughing through the cold air of the holding area. Naomi glanced instinctively toward the sound. Mercer noticed. "You care more about strangers than yourself?" he asked with disbelief. Naomi looked back at him. Somebody should. The rain outside intensified again, rattling hard against the windows like handfuls of gravel. A patrol officer entered through the front doors carrying the smell of wet pavement and cigarette smoke with him. He froze slightly when he noticed Naomi's partially shaved head and the pile of curls scattered across the floor tiles. Nobody explained it to him. Nobody needed to. The atmosphere in the room already carried the weight of embarrassment disguised as authority. Mercer straightened his posture and forced a dry laugh. "Do not look at us like we are monsters," he said. "You brought this on yourself." Naomi held his stare for several seconds. Her expression remained unreadable. "No," she said quietly. "You brought this on yourselves." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Even Brooks shifted uncomfortably beside the desk. Mercer walked closer until he stood directly in front of her chair. "You think anybody is going to care about your side of this story?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning this entire city will move on like nothing happened." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward the blinking security camera again. "Red light. Steady. Patient." "Maybe," she replied. "But truth has a strange way of waiting for the right room before it speaks." Mercer frowned at her, clearly irritated by the calm certainty in her voice. He did not understand why she still sounded composed. He did not understand why fear never fully appeared in her eyes. And that confusion began irritating him more than defiance would have. Brooks picked up the clippers again and stared down at them for a second before asking quietly, Who exactly do you think you are? Naomi looked directly at him then. Rainwater rolled slowly down the station windows behind her, while thunder echoed low across the city skyline outside. Her voice stayed gentle when she answered. Tonight, she said, I am simply someone paying attention. The station clock finally clicked past midnight as cold rain continued washing across the streets outside Westbrook Precinct. Naomi Ellison sat beneath the harsh fluorescent lights with one side of her head nearly bare now. Tiny dark curls scattered across the floor around her chair like fallen leaves after a storm. Officer Brooks stared down at the clippers in his hand before running them once more across the remaining hair near her temple. The buzzing sound echoed against the concrete walls while Sergeant Mercer signed another report with quick, irritated movements. Nobody in the room seemed comfortable anymore, but nobody wanted to admit why. Naomi remained perfectly still. Her calmness no longer looked like weakness. It looked like endurance. The younger female officer behind the desk kept glancing toward Naomi before quickly looking away each time their eyes almost met. Finally, she cleared her throat softly. Sergeant, she said carefully, maybe this has gone far enough. Mercer did not even look up from his paperwork. Then stopped watching. The woman pressed her lips together and said nothing more. Brooks forced out a laugh, though it sounded thinner now. You know, he muttered while setting the clippers onto the counter again. Most people would have broken by now. Naomi slowly raised her eyes toward him. Broken people often become cruel, she replied quietly. That does not mean cruelty is strength. Brooks leaned back against the desk and folded his arms, pretending her words did not bother him. But the room had changed. Even the officers moving through the hallway outside seemed quieter now whenever they passed the open doorway and caught sight of Naomi sitting there beneath the flickering lights. Rainwater tapped steadily against the windows. Somewhere deeper inside the station, a television played low evening news coverage nobody was really listening to. Mercer finally stood and walked toward Naomi until he was directly in front of her chair again. You think you are teaching us some moral lesson? He asked coldly. Naomi looked up at him with tired but steady eyes. No, she answered. I think people teach themselves who they are when nobody stops them. Mercer stared at her for several long seconds. Then he reached down, grabbed the booking form from the desk beside her, and glanced at the mostly blank information sheet. Funny, he said. You still never told us what you do for work. Brooks smirked immediately. Let me guess, he said. Social activist? College professor? Something like that. Naomi said nothing. Mercer flipped the clipboard shut with annoyance. See, that is the problem. People walk in here demanding respect while hiding behind attitude. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the silver bracelet still resting against her wrist. Grace under pressure. The engraved words caught the fluorescent light for half a second. She thought about tomorrow morning. About the courtroom downtown, waiting quietly in darkness at this very moment. About the stack of pending misconduct hearings already scheduled before her bench. About the files carrying Mercer's name and Brooks's name sitting untouched inside her chambers less than 3 miles away. She could end this immediately with one sentence. One sentence, and the entire station would change. But then she remembered the frightened teenage boy behind the frosted glass partition. If she revealed herself now, tonight would suddenly become about her status instead of their behavior. The system would protect itself again. Excuses would appear. Reports would vanish. People would apologize only because they feared consequences. Naomi slowly lifted her gaze back toward Mercer. Some people only respect titles, she said softly. That is why they fail to recognize humanity. Brooks scoffed and grabbed the clippers one last time. Humanity, he muttered. Lady, all we see tonight is somebody who thought she could interfere with police business. Naomi looked directly at him while rain rolled endlessly down the windows behind her. No, she said quietly. What you see tonight is what happens when power believes nobody important is watching. And for the first time since she entered the station, neither officer had a response ready. By 1:30 in the morning, Westbrook Precinct had grown strangely quiet. The laughter was gone. The sarcastic remarks had faded into low conversations behind closed doors and the occasional shuffle of paperwork echoing through the hallway. Rain still poured outside, steady and cold, turning the station windows into dark mirrors streaked with silver water. Naomi Ellison now sat alone inside a holding cell at the far end of the corridor. The metal bench beneath her felt cold through her coat, and the air carried the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with damp concrete. A thin blanket rested folded beside her, untouched. The fluorescent light above the cell buzzed softly every few seconds, casting pale shadows across the gray walls. Naomi leaned back slowly and closed her eyes for a moment. Her scalp still tingled where her hair had been shaved away. When she lifted her hand carefully to touch the side of her head, her fingertips met bare skin instead of curls. The feeling should have broken her. It should have filled her with humiliation or rage or grief. Instead, all she felt was exhaustion. Deep, quiet exhaustion. Somewhere down the hall, a coffee machine clicked on automatically. Footsteps moved past the holding cells, then faded again. Naomi opened her eyes and stared through the bars toward the darkened station lobby beyond. She could see the blinking red security camera from here too. Still recording. Still patient. She thought about her father again. About the courthouse floors he used to mop overnight while she studied for exams at the kitchen table nearby. He always came home with tired eyes and aching hands, but he never allowed bitterness to settle into his voice. Never become cruel just because cruelty found you first, he used to say. Naomi swallowed slowly as rain tapped against the roof overhead. Those words felt heavier tonight. A younger officer walked past the cell carrying paperwork, then slowed when he noticed her awake. He hesitated awkwardly before stopping completely. Naomi recognized him as the officer who had arrived earlier during the rainstorm and silently taken in the scene without asking questions. He looked no older than 24. "Ma'am," he said quietly, almost embarrassed to speak. Naomi lifted her eyes toward him. "Yes." The officer glanced down the hallway, first to make sure nobody was listening. "I just wanted to say." He stopped himself, struggling for the right words. What happened tonight should not have happened. Naomi studied his face for a moment. Nervous. Ashamed. Human. "Thank you," she said softly. The officer nodded once before quickly continuing down the hallway. Naomi watched him disappear around the corner. Even now, after everything, she still noticed small kindnesses. Tiny moments where conscience managed to survive inside broken systems. Thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the city skyline. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the wet floor near the bars of the cell. Strands of her hair still clung to the sleeve of her coat. She brushed them away gently with trembling fingers. The silence around her deepened. No reporters. No lawyers. No courtroom titles. No black judicial robe hanging behind her office door downtown. Tonight there was only a tired black woman sitting alone beneath cold fluorescent lights while rain fell endlessly outside. And somehow, stripped of every symbol of authority, Naomi still carried herself with more dignity than anyone else inside the building. She rested her head lightly against the concrete wall behind her and listened to the storm for a while. The city sounded distant from here, muted, blurred by rain and darkness. Then, very softly, Naomi whispered words almost too quiet to hear even herself. "Tomorrow we'll remember." And after she said it, the holding cell fell silent once again except for the steady sound of rain washing through the night. Morning arrived gray and heavy over downtown Baltimore. Rainwater still clung to the courthouse steps when Sergeant Kyle Mercer climbed out of his patrol vehicle, adjusting the collar of his uniform beneath the cold October wind. Officer Brooks walked beside him carrying a paper cup of coffee and complaining quietly about the early hearing neither of them seemed concerned about. The two officers moved through the crowd outside the federal courthouse with the relaxed confidence of men who believed they had survived another bad night without consequences. Reporters lingered near the entrance discussing a police misconduct case scheduled for review that morning, but Mercer barely listened. He had attended enough hearings to know how these things usually ended. Delays. Technicalities. Quiet dismissals behind closed doors. Inside the courthouse lobby, polished marble floors reflected the pale overhead lights, while attorneys hurried past carrying thick folders and briefcases. Brooks took another sip of coffee and smirked. "After this hearing, I am taking 3 days off," he muttered. "I need a break from everybody acting like cops are the enemy." Mercer grunted in agreement while pressing the elevator button. Neither man noticed the younger female officer from the station standing across the lobby, watching them silently near the security checkpoint. Her expression looked tense, uneasy. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Several attorneys stepped inside beside them along with a court clerk balancing a stack of legal files against her chest. "Courtroom 7?" the clerk asked. Mercer nodded. "That is us." The elevator climbed slowly through the building while nobody spoke. Brooks stared at his reflection in the polished metal doors and straightened his tie. "Wonder which judge we got," he said casually. "Hopefully not one of those activist types." The court clerk glanced up briefly but stayed silent. When the elevator reached the 7th floor, the hallway outside already buzzed with low conversations and echoing footsteps. Lawyers reviewed notes near the walls while journalists adjusted cameras near the courtroom entrance. Mercer walked forward confidently, barely paying attention to the names engraved beside the courtroom doors. Then Brooks stopped walking. Completely. Mercer frowned and turned back. "What?" Brooks did not answer immediately. His face had gone pale beneath the fluorescent hallway lights. Slowly Mercer followed his stare toward the bronze plaque mounted beside the courtroom entrance. "Presiding Judge, the Honorable Naomi Ellison." For a second, neither officer moved. The sounds around them seemed to disappear beneath the roaring silence, suddenly filling Mercer's ears. Brooks laughed nervously under his breath. "No," he muttered. "That cannot be." But before he finished speaking, the courtroom doors opened. Everyone standing in the hallway straightened instinctively. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." Conversations died instantly. Attorneys closed folders. Reporters lowered their voices. Mercer felt cold move through his chest as Naomi Ellison entered the courtroom from the side chamber, wearing long black judicial robes that flowed softly around her shoulders. Her partially shaved head remained clearly visible beneath the bright courtroom lights. No wig. No attempt to hide what had happened. The entire hallway froze as recognition spread across Brooks's face in real time. Naomi walked calmly toward the bench without once looking directly at either officer. Her expression revealed nothing. Not anger. Not fear. Not humiliation. Only composure. Only dignity. She placed a folder neatly onto the bench before lifting her eyes toward the courtroom. The same steady eyes that had watched them beneath flickering fluorescent lights only hours earlier. Mercer suddenly remembered every word she had spoken inside the station. Truth has a strange way of waiting for the right room before it speaks. His mouth went dry. Brooks lowered his coffee cup slowly, his hand visibly trembling now. Around them, nobody in the courtroom understood the full weight of the silence settling over the room except the three people who had lived through the night before. Naomi adjusted the papers before her, then finally looked directly at the officers for the first time since entering. Calm, unshaken, unreadable. "Be seated," Judge Ellison said softly, and neither man could meet her eyes. The courtroom remained painfully quiet after Judge Naomi Ellison took her seat behind the bench. Sunlight pushed weakly through the tall courthouse windows, reflecting softly across polished wood and rows of empty press seats near the back wall. Sergeant Mercer sat rigid at the defense table beside Officer Brooks. Both men unable to look anywhere except the woman they had humiliated only hours earlier beneath the cold fluorescent lights of Westbrook Precinct. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her black judicial robe calmly before opening the thick case file resting in front of her. Her partially shaved head remained visible beneath the bright courtroom lights, impossible to ignore and yet never acknowledged directly. That silence carried more weight than anger ever could. A court reporter shifted quietly in her chair. Someone near the gallery coughed nervously. Mercer felt sweat gathering beneath the collar of his uniform despite the cold air inside the courtroom. Brooks stared down at his hands, his face pale and exhausted. Neither man looked powerful anymore. They looked small, human, fragile. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the attorneys standing before her. "We are here today regarding allegations of misconduct, procedural abuse, and violations of constitutional protections involving members of the Westbrook Police Department," she said evenly. Her voice never rose, never trembled. The same calm voice from the holding room now carried the authority of the entire courtroom. Mercer swallowed hard. Every word seemed sharper now because she refused to weaponize them. Naomi reviewed the documents carefully while attorneys presented opening statements, but the atmosphere in the room remained strained beneath the surface. Everyone sensed something larger hanging in the silence, even if they did not fully understand it. Then Naomi reached for a separate folder placed beside the official case file. Her movements remained measured, controlled, deliberate. Before this hearing proceeds further, she said softly, the court will review additional footage entered into evidence this morning. Brooks finally looked up in panic. Mercer's jaw tightened immediately. Naomi pressed a small button near the monitor beside the bench. Seconds later, grainy security footage appeared across the courtroom screens. The holding room. Fluorescent lights. Rain against the windows. Naomi sitting silently in the metal chair while electric clippers buzzed nearby. Nobody in the courtroom moved. Nobody spoke. The footage contained no dramatic shouting. No chaos. Only quiet humiliation unfolding beneath blinking red camera lights, while officers laughed casually in uniform. The silence inside the courtroom deepened with every passing second. Brooks slowly lowered his head into his hands. Mercer stared frozen at the screen, watching himself through the cold lens of recorded truth for the first time. The younger female officer from the station sat near the back row now, eyes fixed downward with visible shame. Naomi stopped the footage before the end. She folded her hands gently on the bench. The court, she said calmly, is not interested in revenge. Revenge changes nothing. Her eyes moved briefly toward Mercer and Brooks. Not hateful, not triumphant, only deeply tired. But accountability matters, she continued, especially when authority is mistaken for permission to remove another person's dignity. The words landed harder than any punishment either officer had imagined. Mercer finally forced himself to stand. His voice came out strained and uneven. Your Honor, he began quietly. But the apology stalled in his throat. Naomi watched him silently for a moment before speaking again. Sergeant Mercer, she said gently, if your respect for people depends on knowing their title first, then you do not understand respect at all. The courtroom remained completely still. Brooks wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed by his own emotion. Mercer looked down at the floor, unable to answer. Naomi closed the folder in front of her with soft finality. This court will recommend immediate internal review, suspension pending investigation, and mandatory civil rights evaluation procedures effective immediately. Her voice remained calm from beginning to end. No bitterness, no cruelty, only justice. Then, after a long silence, Naomi added one final sentence that left the entire courtroom motionless. Last night, she said quietly, you saw me as powerless. That was the moment your character spoke loudest. The courthouse slowly emptied beneath the pale gray light of late afternoon. Reporters packed away cameras near the front steps, while attorneys disappeared into waiting black sedans lining the curb outside. Rain from the night before still lingered in shallow puddles along the sidewalks, reflecting fragments of the city skyline beneath a cold October sky. Inside her chambers, Judge Naomi Ellison stood quietly beside the tall window overlooking downtown Baltimore. She had removed her judicial robe and folded it carefully across the back of a leather chair near her desk. The room smelled faintly of old books, coffee, and rain drifting through the cracked window above the radiator. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the cool glass while traffic moved slowly below. Her reflection stared back at her in the window now. The shaved sections of her head remained visible beneath the soft daylight. Different, exposed, honest. For the first time since the night before, she allowed herself a long breath. Not relief, not victory. Something quieter than that. Peace, maybe. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Naomi turned slowly as her clerk opened the office door. There is someone asking to speak with you, the clerk said carefully. Naomi already knew who it was before the name came. Sergeant Mercer. The room fell quiet again for a moment. Naomi looked back out the window briefly before nodding once. Send him in. Seconds later, Mercer stepped into the chambers wearing plain clothes instead of his uniform for the first time since she had met him. Without the badge, he looked older somehow. Smaller too. The confidence that once filled every room around him seemed gone now, replaced by exhaustion sitting heavily behind his eyes. He stopped several feet from her desk, unsure where to place his hands. Naomi gestured calmly toward the chair across from her, but Mercer remained standing. I do not deserve to sit, he said quietly. Naomi studied him for a moment without speaking. Outside the window, wind moved fallen leaves across the courthouse steps below in slow circles. Finally, Mercer lowered his eyes. I spent 22 years convincing myself respect and control were the same thing, he admitted. Last night proved otherwise. Naomi remained silent, listening. Mercer swallowed hard before continuing. When you walked into that courtroom this morning, he paused, struggling with the words. I have never felt shame like that before. Naomi walked slowly around the desk and stopped a few feet away from him. Shame only matters if it changes something, she said gently. Mercer nodded once. His eyes looked wet now, though he tried hiding it. I am sorry, he whispered. Not because of your title. Because of how we treated you when we thought you were powerless. The room stayed silent after that. No dramatic music. No perfect apology capable of repairing everything. Just two human beings standing beneath soft afternoon light while the city moved quietly outside. Naomi finally nodded once. Then remember this feeling, she said softly. And make sure the next person who walks into your station never experiences it again. Mercer lowered his head. I will. A few minutes later, Naomi exited the courthouse alone, carrying her coat over one arm. The air outside felt crisp and cold against her scalp as wind moved gently through the remaining strands of hair near the back of her head. People passed her on the sidewalk without recognizing who she was. A bus hissed to a stop at the corner. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang faintly through the city noise. Then Naomi noticed a little girl standing beside her mother near the courthouse steps. The child wore a pink winter hat pulled low over her head, but beneath the edges Naomi could see patches where chemotherapy had taken most of her hair. The little girl looked up at Naomi curiously for several seconds. Then, slowly, she smiled. Naomi smiled back, just as softly. No pity, no sadness, just recognition. The girl reached up and adjusted her hat proudly before taking her mother's hand again. Naomi watched them disappear into the crowd while sunlight finally pushed through the clouds overhead, spilling gold across the wet pavement around her feet. And standing there beneath the quiet warmth of that light, Naomi Ellison understood something her father had tried teaching her all those years ago at the kitchen table beside the leaking ceiling. Dignity was never something another person could shave away. It lived deeper than humiliation, deeper than fear. And sometimes the strongest form of justice was simply remaining human after the world gave you every reason not to.